Hello and welcome to another Innovation Explained video. Innovation strategy is a topic that many innovators find challenging, so it isn't surprising that we get quite a lot of questions about it. Now there's an old saying, a strategy is only as good as its implementation, and we certainly agree with that. Still, you should always have one. So in today's video, we'll talk about building a strategy that aligns your overall business strategy with your innovation efforts. Let's get to it. Innovation has become a key priority for many leaders, and as many as 96% of executives have defined it as a strategic priority. Yet, a KPMG survey revealed that 59% of companies admit that their innovation efforts are mostly ad hoc, and only 13% believe they've reached a stage where their innovation efforts are properly integrated and truly strategic. Well, with that background, it probably isn't too surprising that most aren't able to achieve the innovation outcomes they were hoping for. And that brings us to the problem. How do we create an innovation strategy that is well aligned with the overall corporate strategy and that is also integrated into daily operations and actually executed upon? Before we dive into the practicalities, let's do a super quick recap to make sure we're on the same page when it comes to the term innovation strategy. All companies have a business strategy, so they have a pretty good idea of what a strategy is or should be. An innovation strategy is not too far from the business strategy. Simply put, a strategy is the set of choices, policies, and actions an organization thinks gives them the best opportunity to achieve their goals and win in the market. An innovation strategy is subservient to that overall strategy, and it's the part of that strategy that is focused on creating something new or improving what you already have. This excludes certain strategic topics such as divestments, but to be clear, innovation strategy is still a super broad topic and plays a central role in most strategies overall. So what's the takeaway from this? Well, I'd boil it down to two key things. Strategy is always about choices and alignment. So throughout the rest of this presentation, we'll provide a few frameworks that can help you make the right choices for your business and make sure that all levels of your organization are aligned behind these choices. The first of these is called the Strategy Choice Cascade, and it was made famous by Lafley and Martin in their book Playing to Win. It's obviously a generic strategy framework, but there are a couple of things that I think make this a great framework for innovation strategy too. First, pretty much every strategy covers the winning aspiration and where to play questions, and many cover the how to win part as well. But far fewer discuss the capabilities and management systems necessary for successfully implementing the strategy, without which the strategy obviously won't be realized. And because a strategy is ever only as good as its execution, this solid focus on execution is the first clear strength of the framework. The second is the cascade part, which is in the name. The idea is that the overall organization has one set of high-level choices, which are basically answers to these questions, but then these same questions and sets of choices have to be made again at every level across the organization for them to be able to succeed at their work. So as you can imagine, a large organization might have dozens of these for each of the different business units and functions of the organization. And having this kind of a simple and uniform framework makes it much easier to align these individual strategies with one another. During this presentation, we'll discuss these questions from the point of view of the innovation strategy. The key is to make sure that your answers to each of these questions will always be strongly aligned with the overall strategy and with one another. The first step is to define what your winning aspiration is, which in practice simply means what you want to achieve with innovation. While simple on paper, in practice this isn't always as clear. The answer should reflect the overall strategy and long-term business goals and help decide on the things that are most likely to drive the business forward in the future. Personally, I've really found that last question to be super helpful here. If you could imagine yourself 5 to 10 years from now, what would winning look like? And not just for yourself and your financials, but especially for your customers. Now, that's called future back thinking, and there's a great book on the topic called Lead from the Future by Mark Johnson, whom we actually interviewed a while back. This can be really helpful for detaching yourself from the current state, which is a common problem many strategies suffer from, but one that is especially problematic for innovation strategies. For example, it's common to say, we want to grow 5% a year for the next 5 years, 3 of which will come from our existing products and 2 of which will come from new products. That will be quite limiting, and you'll rule out many of your potentially best innovations, as you'll only focus on the kinds of innovations that will lead you to these target figures, which in this case means new products that are slight variations of the existing ones. You will ignore both innovations that might start off too small but have a lot of potential down the road, and also those that seem too ambitious and risky to meet these kinds of goals with these timelines. Once there's a winning aspiration, the next step is to define where you want to play. This basically means choosing the markets you'd like to win in and think that you have a good chance at that. This can be anything from geographies to industries and segments. There's not just one right way to define a market here. And for innovation, you might often actually want to redefine the traditional market borders. So it's better to focus on customer needs than it is to benchmark yourself against the competition, even though that can obviously be useful sometimes too. Anyway, the important thing is to understand that this decision has to be aligned with the winning aspiration that came before this, but also the how to win decisions that come after this. And because these are so deeply linked, you can't make any of these choices in a vacuum. If you're in a strong business in a growing market, you can just keep going with the same core markets, business models, and offerings as before. But if you're not, you might need to plot out a slightly new course. So, if you do need a new course and new markets, there are many ways you could go about that. But in a nutshell, it typically boils down to a couple of key choices. The first is whether you want to be defensive or go on the offense aggressively and aspire for breakout growth. The second, which comes after the first, is whether you need to transform the core or expand into non-core areas. Typically, if your core still has legs remaining, you will want to keep growing and profiting from that, but start to innovate towards some non-core areas to diversify and create the next stage of your growth. If, on the other hand, your core is already on the decline or on the verge of that happening, you need to be a bit more aggressive with these efforts and really focus on transforming the existing core towards areas where you see the most potential. You should focus on one of these as your current main strategic driver, but often it might make sense to also think ahead and plan for the longer-term future. An example that everyone is probably familiar with is how Apple famously transformed their core with the iPhone. Obviously, that business is still strong and there's no real sign of decline, but in recent years, they've focused on expanding into digital services and peripherals like AirPods to both defend the current core and also seek some additional growth. But at the same time, they're already working on the next generation of products, be it cars, VR devices, or whatever, to try to find that next stage of breakout growth that might one day become that new core. Now, the next question is how to win. And this is the part where good strategies start to gradually separate themselves from the rest. Here's where you start to lay down a realistic path towards your goals. Ideally, you'd of course like to have a unique value proposition and a set of solid competitive advantages, but when we're talking about innovation, you're usually just in the process of building these out. We'll next share a couple of frameworks that you might find helpful here, but regardless, the key is to be realistic and brutally honest with yourself. One of the best frameworks I've found for thinking about this problem is the value innovation model from the Blue Ocean strategy. The idea is that with a great strategy, you shouldn't just be a little better or a little cheaper than your competition. You should be so much better that there isn't even real competition. And a very practical way to think about that is to be both better and cheaper than the competition. There are many ways to achieve that in practice, but it always requires you to think about the market and the value proposition differently and make clear choices on whom you want to serve and focus on. You might think that it requires some kind of hardcore proprietary technological innovation, but often this is possible if you just focus on serving currently underserved market segments in a smarter way, and that's the true core of the value innovation theory. For example, at Viima, we've succeeded in building a solution that is cheaper than the competition, but also a much better fit for a large portion of the industry, which is also the segment that is growing the fastest. And that combination is very challenging for the incumbents to overcome, as it would require them to fundamentally change the way that they operate. But let's take a step back and look at some of the ways in which we might try to build this kind of a clear advantage. A while back, the consulting company Strategy identified 3 primary ways that innovators might approach building this competitive advantage. First, the market readers. They monitor their customers and the competition closely and try to innovate and position themselves to win in the parts of the market that are likely to be the most lucrative for them. By definition, this typically means a pretty heavy focus on incremental innovation. Tech drivers then focus their internal R&D and technology capabilities to create novel technologies and products that can help them dominate existing markets or create entirely new ones. Need seekers, on the other hand, focus on intimately understanding the needs of the customers and then building solutions that best create value for that segment. All 3 are perfectly viable paths that you may take, and the right one usually depends on your current strengths and organizational culture, because those are fundamentally really difficult to change. Having said that, if you have the luxury of choosing, according to the strategy and research, need seekers are by far the most likely to succeed in their innovation efforts, with more than double the success rate of the other approaches. Now, we're moving on to the part that separates the truly great innovators from the rest, and that is the execution. The first question here are the fundamental capabilities required to win. There are, of course, some common qualities that every innovator should have, such as curiosity, empathy, and ability to think critically. But what we mean by this here are things like culture, technologies, knowledge, and skills. These are unfortunately different for every organization, so we can't just give you a simple answer here, but the idea is that you should take a long and hard look at where you currently are and then figure out what you need to add or build to be able to pull off your strategy. This step is also a good reality check for your previous steps and the strategy as a whole. For example, if you want to win by delivering novel breakthrough technologies, you better have the skills, knowledge, and R&D budget to come up with one, as well as the chops for commercializing it, none of which is easy or likely to come cheap. Last but not least, the 5th choice that will guide the actions of the organization in the day-to-day has to do with the management systems. In practice, that means having organizational structures, processes, and incentives in place that support and guide your people in innovating towards your strategic goals, as opposed to blocking those efforts. Innovation doesn't just happen, you need to make it happen, and at the scale of the entire organization. So, make sure everything is organized and led properly, and try to provide your teams with proven techniques, tools, and systems for driving innovation in their day-to-day work. This is again another reality check that will give you some clarity on the feasibility of your strategy. For example, if you have a handful of people from different parts of the organization with completely different goals, working on an innovation with a 35% time allocation, it's pretty obvious that not much will come from that. To conclude, let's recap some of the best practices here. The first and probably most important thing you need to get right is to make sure that your innovation strategy is actually focused on achieving your overall business objectives as an organization. If this isn't the case, you won't get far. Second, as mentioned, a strategy is ever only as good as its execution. So if you're an innovation leader, you need to focus the vast majority of your efforts on ensuring that execution is done well. Now, the beauty of focusing on execution is that you will learn what works and what doesn't in practice. This continuous learning and adaptation of the strategy is crucial because even if the strategy was perfect when it was first created, you aren't operating in a vacuum and things change, so you'll need to roll with those changes. And finally, to succeed at executing that strategy, you'll need to repeatedly communicate it, and even more importantly, make sure it's integrated into everyday practices and processes of the organization. And in that process, the right tools can be pretty helpful for supporting and reinforcing these processes and increasing transparency. So, if you don't yet have a tool for that, you might want to give Viima's free plan a try, or have a chat with one of our experts to help you with that. And with that, we conclude our session for today. If you have any questions for us, please leave those in the comments below, and please subscribe to stay up to date on our future videos. Thanks for watching. We'll see you again soon.